Always a pleasure for me to be at the Middle East Institute, and thanks so much, Kate, for organizing this. Appreciate it. I would like to start, first of all, by talking about the dilemma of those of us who've been studying public opinion in the Middle East for such a long time, and why, in some ways, a lot of our analysts and politicians and governments have not really predicted what happened in Tunisia and Egypt. And it's interesting, if you what happened to the, here it is, okay. In 1998, I actually did just as I was starting to do my polling in the Arab world systematically, I actually ran my only cartoon op-ed in newspapers, which is in the Los Angeles Times. And it was really intended to show the analyst's dilemma about public opinion, because revolutions are so rare in history. They happen every once in a long while, and in the Middle East particularly, we have had only really one until recently that you can call a revolution, which is Iran. And that, those of us who've been observing that public sentiment went against governments year after year after year after year, if you start telling, well, it's going to explode, it's going to explode, it's going to explode, you're essentially predicting mostly wrong, because it happens only rarely. And so one day it explodes and no one expects it. And obviously there's never been really a doubt about the growing gap between governments and publics in the Middle East. We've been documenting this every year. The public opinion polls, particularly the ones in the Arab world that I have been doing over the past decade, which were intended to measure not only public opinion but also the impact of the new media on public opinion and identity, has indicated every single year that the gap is growing and it's untenable. In fact, particularly in Egypt, in fact, there was a couple of pieces that we've done on this, calling it untenable. One in Survival 4 years ago, called America in Arab Eyes, and had a particular section on Egypt, and actually one for the Middle East Institute, a special issue just a couple of years ago on the 30th anniversary of the Camp David agreements, talking about how even the elites find themselves at a place that is not tenable, that it has to change. It just cannot be sustained. So why the surprise? I want to talk about it in a minute, because I want to come back clearly to the information revolution and what it has done. But I'd like to talk basically about three themes, and in the process tell you the information that we've had. And these three themes I picked up really out of the interview with Wael Ghunaim, the short interview with Wael Ghunaim, as he was released from detention and was immediately interviewed by Dream TV within hours of being released. And it's very interesting to watch it because it tells you something about the psychology of the people who basically organized it. We could talk about what the cause of the revolution is, and whether it's in Egypt or Tunisia. We could talk about what instruments were employed to make it possible. Those are two different questions. But I want to make just 3 points about those who organized it, and I want to have a little bit more of a reflection on that. And number one, I know initially, particularly when the riots began in Tunisia and they turned into a revolution, and then even as they started in Egypt, people called them food riots. I think let's not underestimate the importance of food and economy and the widening gap between rich and poor in the Middle East. No doubt about that. It's a factor. It's always been a factor. We've seen many revolts in the Middle East over food and economy. But this is a massive revolution that is so widespread at different segments of society. It is not at the core a food revolution. It is a dignity revolution. And when I say a dignity revolution, I want to tell you what we have been finding, and that's a term I'm not using lightly. It's not a soft term. First, if you listen to the people who started it, like Wael Ghunaim, and unpack what they say, first of all, they were not poor. I mean, these people extremely comfortable, living the good life. These were not, poor and uneducated, those who coordinated and got the ball rolling on this revolution. So maybe a lot of other people joined partly for economy, But clearly the organizers, the ones who made it happen, were not doing it for food. No doubt about that. But what is it? What do I mean here by dignity? It's kind of interesting to see Wa'il Ghanem, and I'll use him as an example just in order to make the point, saying on January 25, for the first time in a long time, I felt proud to be an Egyptian. I felt proud to be an Egyptian. That's an extraordinary thing to say, because when I say it's about dignity, I mean it is about the pervasive sense of resignation, humiliation of the citizen in much of the Arab world, and certainly in Egypt. Not only vis-a-vis their governments, but vis-a-vis the outside world. Not only did they feel the government would not empower them internally, but they didn't feel their governments represented their identity. That what government stood for was not what they stood for. That they were not identifying with the state. And all they knew was the state and government and one and the same. It isn't that because the government, Mubarak had been in office for 30 years. The regime in Tunis has been there for a long time if you take the Bourguiba and the Ben Ali regime combined. So they don't differentiate between state and government. Dawla is both the government and the state in their mind. And we found that in the identity questions. One of the questions I ask is, I know that you're all of the following: Arab, Muslim, Egyptian, Moroccan, or Christian for that matter. But which one is more important to you today? And when we started doing the polling a decade ago, in Egypt particularly, the overwhelming majority said, I'm an Egyptian first. In 2009, 2010, only 1/3 of the public said, I'm an Egyptian first. And if you know Egypt, knew how powerful the Egyptian identity is and has been, even through the Pan-Arab years, it is quite extraordinary shift. And I bet you that if I were to do a poll tomorrow, I would have a majority say I'm an Egyptian first. There was a certain sense of pride. That sense of pride had to do with not just the internal issues, because issues of identity have to do with the internal humiliation, but also the external humiliation. And I think if you look at what we have been witnessing in terms of the gap between governments and publics over the decade, it is very clear on core issues that they care deeply about. Their position was profoundly different from the government's position. An example, I never ask questions, is your government popular, do you like it or not? I think it's very hard to do in authoritarian. I don't want to put them in that position to answer and expect the answer to be directly honest. I think you might get something out of it, but I never do that in my questions. So I always ask questions that are indirect, that tell me something about where they are vis-a-vis the governments. And one of the questions we ask, for example, is name the leader you admire most in the world outside your own government. I don't want them to evaluate Mubarak or Ben Ali or whoever, just to evaluate outside to see who are the symbols. And typically, the symbols are exactly the enemies of the governments. And they're looking at it largely through the prism of the Arab-Israeli issue and the confrontation with the U.S. And so Hassan Nasrallah, just as he was being confronted by the Egyptian government in 2009, was number one. Hugo Chavez, Venezuela is high up there. Erdogan of Turkey is up there. And not a single sitting Sunni Arab leader was on that list in any of the governments, among the top 5 in any of the places that we have measured. It just tells you how disgusted the public was with them. And